At the crossroads of great change, we are faced with a need for great resolve. To challenge the challenging, to build a resilient world for tomorrow. And while we remain rooted to the realities of our communities, today the systems we create, the conversations we hold, actively question these realities and make space for change. Because for 1 billion Indians to thrive, we must relook at our realities as fluid, our potential for change as flexible and interconnected. So this year, we are coming together to embrace that potential of transforming communities through a convergence of perspectives and continued action that rebuilds the future with resilience.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 13th edition of the Dasra Philanthropy Week. While the last decade has given us great reason to celebrate our economic progress, the devastating pandemic has forced us to confront our current reality. There are two stark realities: becoming one of the largest growing economies called India, and the other one called Bharat, where 400 million realities have become the largest number of extreme poor globally. With this backdrop and the fresh wounds of the COVID war, this year's forum focuses on continuity, community, and convergence, sharing learnings for collaborative action for greater continuity, keeping communities at the center, and forcing convergence through inclusive, scalable solutions, accelerating Dasra's vision, our transformed India where 1 billion thrive with dignity and equity. With you today, Dasra celebrates its 22 years of pioneering an approach to shaping collaborative philanthropy, which has new players, tremendous innovation, and changing landscape. Regardless, Dasra's work is guided by a strong belief in prioritizing the lives of vulnerable communities, trusting and respecting the wisdom of local homegrown nonprofits, and leveraging the power of trust-based networks to build social capital with a JEDI lens, which is gender, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Dasra now thrives on core capabilities, leading collaborative platforms and catalyzing proximate philanthropy towards Dasra's mission, collaborative action to accelerate social change. Since 1999, Dasra has strengthened the social sector talent pipeline with over 350 Dasra alumni, fundraised more than $280 million, supported 1,000+ diverse NGOs across the country, and affected the lives of over 90 million Indians. We need a philanthropic revolution and a bold ambition. By 2030, Dasra aims to raise $1 billion and affect 500 million lives. Join us in this urgent call to action. 1 billion thriving. The nation needs you. Bharat needs you. Welcome to the session called Pay What It Takes for Impact, From Insights to Action. We are in partnership with the Bridgespan Group. Over to you, Pritha.
Thank you so much, Vrinda. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to begin this session with a bit of dreaming. I'm sure when I ask most of the Indians, or in fact, most people globally, what they're wishing for, I think the dream today would be that there's no second and consequent waves of any such pandemic. Another dream could be that there is much more peace and far less violence in the world. Just in the context of the social sector, our biggest dream here as the Pay What It Takes India initiative is to dream of a very strong and resilient nonprofit sector in India. So let's dream of not just a Fortune 100 of NGOs, but let's say a Fortune 1000 of NGOs in the country. And what we mean by Fortune 1000 here are NGOs that have long-term, multi-year agreements and partnerships with many funders that does not require them to raise funding year on year. Fortune 1000 means that that NGO actually has to think when a funder or anyone asks them, what's your percentage of non-program costs? That lexicon should just go out of action. And NGOs should be able to raise money easily, not just for programs, but also for their non-programmatic costs. Being in the Fortune 1000 of NGOs also implies that they can invest not just in strong programs, but in being very strong organizations. And that means having strong leadership, strong HR, strong finance, strong technology, and everything else that's the backbone of any organization, be it for-profit or not-for-profit. So let these NGOs not have to ask money for building organizations, but for them to be investing in it very thoughtfully. Finally, for you to be in the Fortune 1000 of the nonprofits, you need to have strong reserves or corpus so that, God forbid, there's another crisis or shock to society. NGOs are not thinking about survival, but about thriving, just as we heard Dasra's dream for the next few years. And lastly, my dream is that irrespective of the NGO's geography or location, whether in far rural, remote tribal areas or in populated urban areas, or indeed irrespective of the caste, creed, gender, religion of the leader that leads the NGO, can they still dream to be in the Fortune 1000 in the country? So here's a session for the next 90 minutes or so, where we will take you to make this dream a reality. And of course, it cannot just be one session that can enable this dream to work out, but really the efforts of everyone that's on this session and many more that are not here for us to take the message to them to become stronger and more resilient. So whether you're a funder or an NGO, please do listen in intently to the next few minutes of our presentation that my colleagues Anushka and Shashank will walk through, and then a very action-oriented panel of funders and NGO leaders that will talk us through how to make this dream of Fortune 1000 a reality. So on that note, I would hand over to my colleague Shashank to kick us off on the insights from this year's work on Pay What It Takes India.
Thank you, Preeta. And good afternoon, everyone. Let's start with the point that Preeta made about this dream. And moving on to the next slide, what I'm really proud about this dream is it's not just a dream that Preeta is watching or it's my dream. It's a collaborative dream that we are all dreaming today. The NGOs, intermediaries, and funders are coming together and working together on this cause, this purpose that is driving all of us. Going forward, we all want to make this a reality. We have 5 very strong anchor funders, OD Chandra Foundation, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, EdelGive Foundation, Ford Foundation, and Omidyar Network, which seed funded us in year 1 and has been championing this cause. There are many more funders who have been engaged with us. There are leading intermediaries who are working all together just to make this reality. And what we want out of this session is more people, more funders talk about this, discuss this with their partner NGO leaders, talk to the funders about this issue that is plaguing the sector right now and the way that we can move forward. So at this moment, I would want to just get a sense of which kind of organizations does our audience affiliate with. So my colleague Lahari will just publish a poll, which you could quickly fill in while I move to the next slide. Larry, could you open the poll, please? So while the poll goes on, I'll quickly move to the next slide. And Preeta has already talked about what the vision is. We want a stronger and more resilient NGO sector in service of the impact that we all want to create. We are all here, whether it's NGOs, funders, or intermediaries, not because of any other motive, but because there is an intrinsic desire to serve the communities that is driving us. And what we believe is that through this collaborative action, which started with building a robust evidence base and initiating dialogue in the current year, we will be able to bring about the change that will be required in the Indian NGO sector to ensure that the convergence that Dasra talks about between Bharat and India happens and happens fast enough. It's criminal for us to have the largest number of people under the poverty line. And we believe having a stronger and resilient NGO sector will accelerate that. So moving to the next part, what I'll talk about is our year one research. So we are right now in the year two of this initiative. In year one, our focus, as I said in the previous slide, was on building an evidence base and using mixed methods, talking to multiple stakeholders. What we found was that this problem was widespread, it was severe, and it was urgent. 83% NGOs that we surveyed talked about the challenge in recovering indirect costs. So they were not able to pay for their core functions, important functions that are required for the NGOs to operate as resilient organizations. 54% in September 2020 had reserves of less than 3 months. As COVID pandemic progressed, this number dwindled down to 38%. And the resilience of NGOs to sustain another shock of this sort is very, very shaky. We are all aware of stories from the field where smaller NGOs are facing the brunt. A lot of NGOs are struggling to make ends meet. And what is really getting affected is the service that they were providing to the community. It was the impact that they were working towards. Similarly, when we talk about the organization development piece, 18% NGOs, only 18%, said that they were able to invest adequately in organization development. More than 80% of NGOs who were participating in the research actually said that inability to invest in organization development hampered their ability to deliver impact. They are not able to hire the right people. They were not able to hire adequate number of people. They were not able to innovate on the programs. All the things that we expect an NGO to do, there was not enough money for them. It was more about just running the programs. And what we also found through indicative research of a small sample of NGOs was that NGOs which were able to invest intentionally in organization development were able to grow twice as fast in terms of annual budgets as compared to those which were not investing in organization development. So there is enough evidence to show that NGOs are struggling. They are needed. There is no question about it. And for NGOs to continue and sustain the impact that they create, organization development is needed. Hence, what the first year research also highlighted were 5 key principles that need to be adopted by funders, NGOs, and sorry, Anushka, I'll move to the slide. Preeta had actually talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion in her talk earlier in the introduction. But there is a clear divergence. Some of the NGOs are more vulnerable, or more of a certain kind of NGOs are vulnerable than others. 2 axes which came out very clearly was NGOs led by Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi leaders. More of them had never experienced an operating surplus in last 3 years. They were always operating at a break-even or at losses. 66% of non-metro and rural NGOs had never had an operating surplus in last 3 years. The research did not go into the root causes of why this discrepancy was, but it was very clear that there was a discrepancy. There were certain NGOs which were struggling more than the others. And it is for us as the sector, as funders, intermediaries, and NGO leaders to think about what's causing it and actively work on ensuring that this is mitigated. Moving to the 5 key principles, I'm sorry, I'm just too attached to them and I just want to get to them. The first principle sounds very obvious, but we found it doesn't happen. Developing multi-year relationships, not looking at it as a transaction, but looking at it as a partnership. Closing the indirect cost funding gap, acknowledging the key role that NGOs play and the key roles that the core functions play for the NGOs in delivering the impact and paying for those functions. Investing in NGOs organization development. It's not just about the immediate output matrix. It's about the long-term impact that organization development can bring. And that's what the funders need to also think about. Building financial resilience. We have a situation with COVID where a lot of NGOs are struggling. A lot of them cannot take another year of a similar shock. Unless NGOs have adequate reserves, they cannot take even normal operational shocks of a key funder walking away because of change in strategy. They have to just treat their programs in a very tactical manner because they do not have resilience to continue programs for 3 months, 6 months, even if, let's say, a funder who was contributing 20% of that program has stopped funding them. And then finally, embedding a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens in grant making. Investing in more proximate organizations, investing in organizations where the leaders are coming from the community that they intend to serve. That's critical for us to have inclusive development. The good part of this is that there has been a great traction in the sector. So last year, when we came out with this report, which was more about evidence, from then to now, it's heartening to see how many conversations have been initiated, how many funders are reflecting on their own practices, looking at how they can change certain of their practices and see what all can be done. How these leading intermediaries are coming together to make it easier for NGOs to understand what is required in terms of true cost funding, what is required in terms of organization development. And collaborative action, not the least of that. Like funders are coming together to take care of this critical issue. Grow Fund is an example where leading funders are coming together with a very pinpointed focus on core funding and the organization development needs of the NGO. So we are seeing the green shoots of change that is happening, and we are hoping that these green shoots will make that dream that Peter talked about a reality. With that, in the second year, what we started working on was going deeper to understand what's causing this kind of practice and what is required to bring about that change. And that's what my colleague Anushka will talk about. Over to you, Anushka.
Thanks, Shashank. So as Shashank mentioned, in year one, while we went really deep to understand the problems that NGOs are facing, this year we're looking at the other side of the equation and trying to understand funder motivations, practices, and challenges funders are facing as they strive to create impact. We're very excited to share with you an exclusive preview of our findings from the year two work, which will be formally published later this year in May. So for all of you asking us for the slides and data, this will be published in May, and we're very excited to share a preview with you right now. The findings, which I'll come to shortly, have been based on robust research, including a funder survey, which 75 funders responded to, one-on-one interviews with 50+ stakeholders, and forums for group convenings and input. So without further ado, I'd like to present some of the key findings from my year two research. The first finding that I want to highlight for you is just the strong divergence between what NGOs believe and what funders believe regarding the support and investment that's available for organization development. As Preeta mentioned, organization development is organizational investment in aspects like strategy, leadership development, measurement and evaluation, and so on, which often form the foundation of an NGO. What we found is that while 70% of NGOs said that most funders do not support OD needs, 75% of funders said that they do support OD needs of NGOs. So we can see a clear discrepancy here. Of course, there are many reasons to explain this, and we will delve into all of those reasons in detail in the report that we share with you. Some examples are the fact that funders are only supporting some NGOs for OD, so a lot of other NGOs might get missed out. Another reason could be that NGOs and funders might have a slightly different understanding of what constitutes org development and what is a sufficient quantum of investment in org development. And lastly, there might be a difference between belief and practice even amongst funders. So these are some reasons, but the key takeaway from this finding is that funders might be more receptive to supporting OD than many NGOs feel. And so it's worth having this conversation more explicitly. Moving on to the next slide, what we found across the board is that there is limited support for financial resilience. As Shashank shared with you from our year one findings, NGOs that we surveyed in 2020 showed low reserves. Almost half of them were not earning a surplus from their operations. And the situation was made much worse by COVID. We also saw that funders also are not contributing to reserves. So only 9% of the 75 funders we surveyed were contributing to corpus. What this means is that there's no avenue for NGOs to build reserves to sustain their programs in case of funding shortfall or in case of external shocks like COVID. Of course, there are regulatory challenges that many funders face regarding this, CSRs in particular, but food for thought that there's more that we could be doing as a sector to support NGOs. The next finding that I'd love to highlight for all of you is some of the reasons behind the practices we saw. So we saw that NGOs believe that their OD needs are not being supported, there is no support for financial reserves, and that they're struggling to ensure coverage of indirect costs. When we asked funders on some of the reasons for this, what we found is a trust deficit. So only 23% of funders believe that NGOs share accurate cost structure and OD needs. And only 21% of funders believe that NGOs spend sufficient time and understand the benefits of org development and corpus building. In other words, almost 75% to 80% funders did not believe in these statements. While there are many challenges that NGOs face that might lead to this, what this does tell us that there's strong scope for more honest and transparent conversation between funders and NGOs going forward. With this, I'll come to our last key finding, which is a slight dissonance in funder intent and practice on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Starting with a strong finding, a promising finding, we found that almost 60% of funders that we surveyed are tracking the proportion of the funding that is supporting equity and inclusion of at least one of the marginalized groups stated here, most notably communities in geographically marginalized areas and gender or women-focused NGOs. While that's very promising, let's look at the other aspect of using leadership of NGOs as an indicator of the proximity of NGOs to the populations that they wish to serve. What we find here is that not too many funders are actually tracking the leadership of the NGOs that they are supporting. To give an example, while 17% of funders have stated that they're tracking the proportion of funding that's going to Dalit, Bahujan, or Adivasi communities, only 5% are tracking whether they're supporting leadership from that community. This is an interesting finding and worth reflection because of what we found in Pay What It Takes Year 1. As Shashank mentioned, community NGOs led by DPA members were more financially vulnerable than NGOs that were not led by DPA members. So I think this is one finding where more research is needed and more conversation is needed in the sector. With this, I'll pause and would love to get some of your initial thoughts and reactions to some of these 4 findings that we found. I'll request my colleague Lahari to run a poll and would love to understand whether you have personally experienced, either as an NGO or funder, whether you've personally experienced any of these 4 findings that we've talked about, or whether you resonate with them or have seen it happen to others in the sector. So just to recap, the first finding was divergence between funder and NGO perception on OD support in the sector. The second was limited support for financial resilience. The third was funder perception regarding NGO practices, which according to funders served as a barrier for them to support indirect costs and org development of NGOs. And the last point was dissonance in funder intent and practice on aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll just wait for a moment here and would request you all to participate in the survey and let us know if you resonate with any of these findings or have personally experienced them. Once again, I'd love to reiterate that we're very excited to share this full research with you, and it will be published shortly, a few months down the line. We'd also love to know any thoughts and reactions that you might have to these findings. Please feel free to put them in the comment box. And we'll sure we incorporate your input and suggestions as we finalize the report and share it with all of you in the sector. Great. Let me move on to the second big part of our findings that we'd love to share with all of you. So far, we've been talking about funders as a monolith identity, but I believe from all of our experiences, we know that's not true. And so what our research has revealed is 3 distinct funder archetypes based on a difference in their mindset and practice. So the 3 archetypes that our research has revealed is number 1, program proponents. These funders believe that program funding produces the results that they value the most for their limited resources. Behavior associated with program proponents is fixed indirect cost rates between 5 to 15% and limited support for org development. The second big category or funder archetype is adaptive funders. These funders adapt their funding practices for select grantees to cover underfunded administrative and organizational expenses. So associated behavior of this archetype is indirect cost rates that are flexible between 15 to 25%. They may also fund OD in select cases where the NGO partner can make a very compelling case for impact. The last big archetype that emerged from our findings is organization builders. This group believes and values the importance of funding administrative and organizational expenses of NGOs to maximize program impact and maximize resilience of NGOs. So they often offer indirect cost rates exceeding 25% or flexible indirect cost rates that are determined in conversation with their NGO partners. They also often provide OD support. However, across the board, there is limited support for financial resilience across all these archetypes. What we'd love to discuss with you is that each funder archetype is very different both in their mindset and practice. And hence they perceive barriers to funding indirect costs and OD very differently. So the first finding is we asked funders whether they believe that program costs are more important for creating impact than indirect costs. And you can see a very stark variation between the 3 categories of funders here. 67% of program proponents agree with the statement that program costs are more important, whereas only 13% of organizational builders agree with this statement. So while the exact numbers are directional, they do show that there's strong variation in mindsets even amongst funder groups. Moving on to different kinds of barriers, when we look at constraints within the organization, we found that a lot of funders believe that they do not have the right tracking measures for mapping outcomes. To speak a little bit more about that, they don't have the right tracking measures for mapping outcomes for funding for indirect costs for organization development and financial resilience. You can see 50% of program proponents agreed with this, and about almost 30% of organization builders agreed with this. So while there is variation, this is a huge challenge that funders are facing. Other constraints that funders mentioned is not having sufficient funds to cover NGO true costs, and where program proponents, about 33% of them agreed with this statement. On the last row, I'll point out that not too many funders felt that their own organization's policies and systems do not allow for true cost funding. This is a somewhat surprising finding because I believe many NGOs believe that it's organization policies and systems that might be restrictive, but not too many funders felt this was a strong constraint. Moving on to the last set, of external constraints, we can see that reliance on historic or industry practice due to lack of proven role models in the ecosystem was a strong barrier that all funders felt, most notably, of course, program proponents. What this means is that funders felt that there were not too many examples of peer funders providing indirect costs, providing OD support, providing financial resilience that they could use to act as benchmark for their own giving. And lastly, funders across the board were constrained by regulations and government policies to cover the true cost of their grantees. Once again, these are strong barriers that funders face, but there's a strong variation in the extent to which different archetypes of funders face these challenges. I'll conclude by acknowledging something that a lot of you have mentioned in comments as well, which is that CSRs in particular are facing a lot of additional barriers or challenges as they look towards funding for impact. So of the 3 archetypes that we introduced earlier, 70% of the program proponents were CSRs. And in interviews with CSRs, we did realize that there are a lot of additional challenges and barriers that CSRs face. For example, having to fragment a limited budget across multiple sites and programs where their organization might have important stakeholders or operations. Second, lack of clarity around or restrictive nature of CSR policies and regulations. An example is the 5% rule, where many CSRs believe that they can only provide a 5% indirect cost to the NGOs. However, that 5% actually stands for the CSR's own administrative expenses. Third, as some of you actually pointed out in comments, you do face a lot of challenges in identifying NGOs for trust-based partnerships. So that remains a challenge where CSRs have asked for intermediaries and government to step up and provide some solutions to this problem. Fourth challenge is that CSRs often face challenges in meeting strict reporting requirements, given lack of clear or consistent reporting standards amongst different NGOs in the country. And lastly, there's often a compliance-focused approach of decision makers in CSRs, which often comprise CEOs and board members, given limited peer examples of CSRs who are aligning with pay what it takes practices and principles. So I'll stop here and once again would love some of your feedback and input on these emerging findings and would request my colleague Lahiri to share a poll. Let me just share the results of the previous poll very briefly. And then we can move on to the next poll. So it's heartening to see that a lot of you have experienced some of these findings. Most commonly, the first 2 findings, limited support for financial resilience and divergence between funder and NGO perception. Would love to get your reaction to the 3 funder archetypes that we introduced, and would ask Lahiri to share a poll around how many of you, if you're a funder, do you subscribe to, do you see yourself in any of these archetypes? And if you are an NGO, do you see most of your funders subscribing to one of these archetypes? So would love to know your reaction to which of these archetypes resonates with you or you've seen in your personal experience. Great. As you fill this poll, I'll hand over back to my colleague Shashank to walk us through the next steps and the call to action.
Thank you, Anushka. So research is all great, but this research is for a particular purpose. And I think that's what we want to talk about, which is what action do we as a sector need to take? The funder action are the most critical one, given the power dynamics in the sector. It is for the funders to reflect, it is for them to reach out, and it is for them to refine. And the intermediaries and NGOs need to support the funders in their journey. We are, as a collaborative effort, developing tools, insights which can be used. We are also reaching out to funders, NGOs, and intermediaries, engaging with them to see how we can further develop tools and guides which can be useful. So you can always visit bridgespan.org and other partner websites to see what kind of tools are available. But these guides, these toolkits are being created to facilitate the conversation, to facilitate the reflection. A funder, for example, can use the funder insight report, the evidence base that we developed in the last year, and have a conversation with internal stakeholders, with partner NGOs. A funder can also use the OD Toolkit, which has been developed by 6 intermediaries together, to have a conversation about the needs of organization development in their partner NGOs. Similarly, NGO leaders can use the True Cost Guide to assist them in engaging with their existing funders and initiating a conversation on their true cost needs and how the funders can support. And intermediaries can again use these toolkits to support both NGOs and the funders. So what's important right now is to start looking at our own practices as funders, start talking to our peer group, engaging with others, engaging with people who we believe have good practices and understand how they are overcoming some of the challenges that we are facing as individual organizations, and see what can be done to overcome this problem. Because otherwise, we are in a situation where one vital component of the sector, the NGOs, are precariously placed. And it's important that if, as funders, as intermediaries, we want to support the impact, or we aspire for the impact that we really want to achieve, it will not be possible unless we just look at our own practices, our own policies, and amend them in the right manner. So one request for all of you is to, my colleague Kanika has shared a link in the chat. In case you would be interested in getting updates, we will be publishing our report in April or May. We will be happy to share updates with all of you and engage with all of you on this topic. With that, I will hand it over back to Preeta to talk to actual practitioners and see how they have been navigating in this maze.
Thank you, Shashank and Anushka. On this note, we would like to invite the panelists for a very exciting discussion today. They are all well-known and leaders in the sector, so I'm given in the interest of time, I'm not going to be reading out bios, but please do bear with us as we launch into the panel straight away. So I would like to welcome Dhruvi, Vimi, Nagma, and Sujata to the panel. So Vimi, Nagma, and Dhruvi would represent the funder perspectives, and Sujata would be talking about the experience that 17,000 Feet Foundation has had in this area. So welcome everyone to the panel. It's very exciting to hear of your practical experiences after we have heard about what we have found in this study. And I'm sure multiple funders are now thinking which of the 3 archetypes they fit in and what more can be done. And similarly, I hope NGOs are also thinking harder about how they could potentially be in the Fortune 1000 NGO list in the country. So to begin with, I would love to do a round robin with all of you to see what 1 or 2 findings that we have had in the Pay What It Takes India initiative resonates most closely with your experience and what that might mean for your work in the sector. And if you could spend a minute on that, and secondly, in relation to that question, also talk about any one of your practices that relate to the Pay What It Takes principles that would be helpful for the audience to understand the concept better. So maybe we can kick off with Nagma to talk about how EdelGive Foundation works. So the 2 questions, just to repeat, are 1, what finding from the Pay What It Takes second year findings resonate most? And second, to talk about any one of your practices that you're most proud of in race relation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me for this very relevant discussion. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity of sharing this panel with some incredible women who I admire. So thank you. This is a very important topic. And I remember that the first time Preeta had spoken to me about pay what it takes, I was a bit cynical as well. And I said that everybody knows what we don't pay for. So what are we really talking about? Having said that, I'm glad that this exercise was conducted, this movement was started, and we not only call this something that was exactly what it is, so there's no fake branding, but we're talking about pay what it takes, we're talking about bringing out real data on what we're not paying for. The first and the second year findings that came out, for me really was the most basic finding was the most striking. We all, and like I said very offhandedly, that we all know that we don't pay for critical costs. But to say that more than 83% of the organizations did not feel that they had access to this kind of funding, or even just institutional building, the number is just too heart-wrenching. And because we are, as members of a development ecosystem, we know that it's hard. We know that social solutions are hard, and a lot of times we are reacting. When COVID happened, we also saw that post a few couple of months, how paying salaries, ensuring that timelines were met, ensuring that the last mile was served, was so tough on teams that really went with half salaries, were not paid, and still did what it did. We saw the immense stress that this sector went through, but still showed up every single day through the crisis, and it's still showing up really. When we do not invest in good infrastructure for a sector, we are bound to deplete it every time a crisis strikes. We saw 3 waves of COVID. We've seen funders very happily, and very consciously come and deploy money for relief. But the fact is, every time we are being hit like this, the sector is depleting. So for us, really, the shocking number of an 83%, and the fact that there is no access to indirect cost, which means that structures and NGOs are really working on shoestring budgets to deliver exactly what they've promised, which is more service delivery rather than serving communities. And the fact that we as funders have a very important role to play in how funds are deployed was like a home truth. And GROW is really an attempt to bring the focus back. So one of the toughest decisions was that we said 100 NGOs will be given organizational support. And how many of the people that we met said, don't do it like this, you won't get the funds to do it. But it's important to spotlight something like this. And yes, the reaction to what we saw in your report and the action that we chose to take is right now here. GROW is just launched. We have right now 100 NGOs are in the process of receiving their first tranches. And our whole process is there for repeat, so that time and again we remind everyone that if you are really interested in paying what it takes, there are smart ways to do that, and we must step up and do it. So thank you.
Thank you, Nagma. And we'll certainly come back to you to know more about GROW, because there are a lot of rich learnings there, even as you disburse the first tranche. I'd like to move to Dhruvi. Axis Bank Foundation, of course, does yeoman's work in livelihoods, which is even more spotlighted in terms of dire needs in the face of the pandemic. So Dhruvi, would love to hear what resonated with you, and what of your interventions is really relevant in these times.
Sure. So hello everyone, and so I think what resonated with me, it's something we'd already known, but it having numbers behind it, like 70% of NGOs felt that funders don't support, whereas 75% of the funders felt they do. I think that puts out everything, right? Every funder believes, and I don't agree, where some people do know what costs they don't pay, but most people believe that we pay for the full cost. Yeah, it's a feel good, right? We know that we pay for everything, and we don't really know what everything is. And I think having those numbers behind kind of puts it out there. I think to me, what it represents is the lack of relationship, lack of trust, lack of partnership, right? Because if you're a partner, right, and if there's an equal relationship, you would be open to having those conversations, right? To some extent, yes, we know what we don't pay, but by and large, everybody believes that we pay for what we are getting out there. And like what Nagma said, the challenge we're trying to solve is very dynamic. It's in a very dynamic context. The policy changes, your problem and your solution change. Climate changes, your problem and your costing will change. There's inflation, right? We never factor in inflation into all of these costs. And by listening to people, by being agile, we have to be able to evolve to the requirement. Project is a tool. It's just a management tool. It's not going to solve your problem. It's just going to tell you how you're solving your problem. So I think these are some of the characteristics funders need to adopt to be able to remain relevant, to be very honest, in this ecosystem. Yeah.
Thanks, Dhruvi. Vimi, over to you for a 2-minute introduction to this.
Sure. Hello to everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I don't think I'm going to say anything different to what my colleagues have already said. But I think just building a little bit on what has been said is, I see that a lot of funders give humanitarian aid, but then we shy away from giving, paying for indirect cost and giving OD support on an ongoing basis. So we sort of rise up to the occasion when the disaster hits. But if we had invested in an ongoing manner, the NGOs would have been far more resilient and strong to deal with those disasters when they hit us, inevitably. So I think that's something that I resonate with a lot. And of course, the numbers behind is what is shocking. We all know that, and the fact that only 18% of NGOs were able to invest in OD. There is a very small number of NGOs, and they struggle with financial resilience. Not surprising, but it's an issue and it's a big barrier for long-term planning and also for the impact that the NGOs want to create. Liquidity is a day-to-day operational risk, and it does take away from the focus and the energy that the NGOs should have actually on delivery of the program, rather than struggling for the financial resilience. And on your second question, Preeta, in terms of what one thing that I'm pleased or proud about is that CIFF's approach to holistic funding. As an organization, we have a lot of areas for improvement, but I think one of the things that I do feel pleased about is that we do, pay for a fair share of indirect costs and for OD support wherever that's required. And I think that's really helped. And we didn't do it historically, but it's happened over a period of time where we realized that only program funding could be myopic in many cases, and that such funding can put a lot of strain on the program itself, because the rest of the organization would not be able to keep pace, adapt, or deliver, what the program is trying to achieve. So therefore, we had set up an OD function in early 2019, and we pay for some of the organizational cost as part of that. And also in terms of indirect, in fact, this exercise has helped us. So based on the research identified on the starvation cycle in 2021, we had introduced a new approach to funding indirect costs, especially for our strategic grantee. We took away the cap. We said that we will not limit it to a percentage of indirect cost, but we will actually try and understand the true costs that the grantees have. So we removed that and started having conversations around the number of months of reserves that the organization have, the total funding available to support indirect costs. And these metrics have helped us understand the costs better, but also it has encouraged us to have more open, honest, transparent conversation with our partner organizations. I'll stop at that, pass it back to you.
Thank you, Vimi. I think it's fascinating to hear different perspectives of even funders being transparent and candid, that they are evolving as well. So I'd love to go to Sujata. She's joining us from Kargil, actually, where 17,000 Feet Foundation does work. So Sujata, would love to hear your perspective on this question as we kick off.
So yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me over. And it's a super important discussion, much needed in these times, specifically after COVID. And yeah, I can totally relate to the whole starvation cycle. We've been one of those for quite the longest time. And I will say at 17,000 feet, we're a mid-sized NGO. And the investing in OD has been something that has come to us quite late in life. I would say in just the last year or two of our own, even to understand that an organization like ours needs to invest in, because we're so much hand to mouth in all times, right? So one of many of the key findings that you talked about, it's great to have things in numbers. And yes, I would agree with the rest of my co-panelists on that. Simple things like saying that, 70% of your NGOs believe that funders don't support OD needs, which is true. I mean, I'd say probably a lot more from my perspective, because not only is it, am I talking about generally about funding, but I'm also working in a geographically marginalized community, somewhere so far away from anybody's immediate vicinity, right? So yes, we've had very few. So that really resonates with me, that yes, that we do have very few people who are actually looking at the true costs. Indirect costs, yes, no surprise at all for me there. A lot of your numbers just, put light on the fact that what we've been generally feeling as a complete, what's the word for it? It's just one of the mantras that we NGOs are pretty used to saying, that we just don't get funded, we don't have money, we don't have people, the usual. What we've been saying is a wine. You guys have put it out in numbers, so thank you so much for that. I'll definitely say that is a thing. One interesting thing that you've also come out with, you said, 23% of funders believe that NGOs share cost structures and OD needs, right? And this is super interesting. I think it's possibly true. So here's the deal, right? When funders, or rather when NGOs approach their funders with the true cost of what the program needs are, when you've been time and again asked to reduce your indirect cost, reduce your non-programmatic funding, over time, you just stop reporting it. We're not as transparent enough. So while my funder colleagues here are talking about transparency, I think we need to change that dialogue as well from our side, from an NGO perspective, be completely open and honest and saying, this is our true cost, this is what we need, and not step away from it. So either we as NGOs move towards not even asking for these kind of funds, change your program itself, or learn to figure out other ways to manage your indirect costs and non-programmatic costs. So as a part of your second part of your question, and this is new for us, as to what are the new practices that we are putting into place. Talking about OD itself has now become a big thing. I'm very happy to share that we've had a significant investment into our own capacity building over the last 2 to 3 years. It has shown great impact in terms of confidence within ourselves, as well as the impact we're showing in our beneficiary community. So yeah, so that's the one thing that we're pretty proud of, that we are talking about the fact that we as an NGO, we need to develop first. It's a simple case of, put on your oxygen mask before you can put it on one of those of your beneficiaries. So that's a very big thing for us, and that's what we're starting to do. So I will stop with that and hand it over back to you, Prita.
Thank you, Sujata. So I think we've heard from all of you that, everybody recognizes that this is a big need. But how do we now move into change and action, right? And as Nagma said, initially there could be a lot of skepticism that this has been so in India for like decades, if not longer, right? Centuries, I was tempted to say. But what can really cause a change in mindsets, both of funders and NGOs, because it takes two hands to clap. So NGOs, like you said, Sujata, need to understand that OD is important, need to then know how to present their OD needs, calculate the true costs, to then be able to go to their funders bravely and not worry that they'll be slapped on their face for even programmatic support, but they'll actually get program plus, right? So NGOs need to have that confidence and the ability to transparently, in a trusted way, discuss that. And then funders, like you mentioned, Dhruvi, need to be aware that there is this dissonance. So while everybody might feel that they're doing it all, but in reality, NGOs are not experiencing it. So clearly there is a difference or divergence there. So funders also then need to look carefully at their policies and practice and see what it takes to support stronger nonprofits. So on that note, I'd really like to move towards a more action mindset here on the panel. And maybe we can start with you, Dhruvi, if that's okay, because I know Axis Bank Foundation, is a CSR foundation, nevertheless has done a lot to support NGO partners through multi-year relationships, through building stronger organizations. And I know there have been questions in the chat around regulatory restrictions. And a lot of the CSR interviews we did were actually on one end of the spectrum, where either they said, sorry, regulations don't permit us, or some said we'd love to from the heart, but actually our historic policies or our board or our CSR committee don't allow that. So, we would love for Axis Bank Foundation to actually shine a light on how we've made some of this possible, and share learnings about what other CSR and other foundations in India could imbibe.
Sure. So a couple of things here. One, we were pre-CSR, right? We were set up in 2006. It's been 16, 17 years, and we've been doing one thematic area. We haven't shifted to this flavor of the season. So we've been doing rural livelihoods for now almost 12 years. This whole, if you look at recent history, I'm also not saying go very, very far. I mean, whether you call it philanthropic capital or CSR, initially the funding came from OD. I mean, a lot of organizations have been developed because of inherent core support to those organizations. Somewhere CSR and a very different kind of stakeholders took interest in the space, and it probably became what it is now, where there is suddenly lack of interest, intent, understanding of supporting OD. So it's a recent phenomenon. We have to look at that. We somehow never go back and learn from our own history. A lot of organizations that we see today were built by organizations who funded them for developing them as organizations, right? So we don't really have to go, we just have to go 7 years, 8 years before, and you will find such examples. So one, we coming to CSR and all of that, one, we don't see project as an end, right? It's just a mean. The relationship with the NGO is more important. If you have to look at any kind of sustainability, you have to invest in the NGO. There is no two way about it. Probably being bankers, it helped us look at investments in a certain way. But I think more importantly, we didn't have too much of unlearning to do. We started as we don't call ourselves institutional funders, but majority of our funding is designed to support the organization grow and therefore the impact. Typical mindsets that we see around, which probably needs to change, is that we corner our impact to our funding and isolate it. It's never true. The impact that we see today has shades of people who invested in the area or invested in the organization in the past, and that also gives you also have the same responsibility to invest for future, because changes take time. If you invest today, the results are going to come in the future, right? So you are reaping the benefit of somebody's investment, and you need to kind of pay it forward. We also, funders, believe our project is the only thing around. I mean, just look around and there are multiple projects going on simultaneously, and we nicely turn a blind eye, right? Oh, you are a co-funder? Yeah, we are a co-funder. You are a co-funder? Oh, we didn't know. I mean, we are there. I mean, we are there in the balance sheet. When you visit, these are typical questions we ask, right? So we can't work in isolation. So the moment you open up to the belief that there are other funders working along with you in a project or in an area, see, the project is yours. It's not of the NGO. The NGO is working in an area. The project is yours, right? And there are multiple projects going on. So just by opening your mind to other donors, and donors talk to each other, right? Just don't believe they work together. So this collaboration also has to move beyond the panel discussions to action and to financials and balance sheets to see we are funding the same thing. And therefore, are we sharing the cost? If funders believe they are sharing the cost, then the balance sheets are not showing that, right? So one needs to be kind of walk the talk and see how your numbers are shaping up, and it's not too difficult, right? So we need to not work in isolation. And here, I think a lot of responsibility lies with the funder. And increasingly, I'm seeing intermediaries who are exerting a lot of influence, especially to new funders. And a lot of responsibility lies with us. Funders will have to make the first move. Funders will have to acknowledge. We also have to believe that if I am not paying the indirect cost, somebody else is, right? Somebody is paying the cost. So if I'm not paying it, somebody is subsidizing my cost. So people who pay usually subsidize the cost that others don't pay, right? And those funders don't get kind of ever spoken about because you don't want to, don't want to disturb the apple cart. Don't want to let go of your funder who's funding your indirect costs. And these are a lot of finer challenges that we see. So like I said, we need to kind of take a bolder move. If it means engaging your stakeholders internally, I don't think CSR laws are restrictive at all, right? I mean, CSR laws don't determine what are your indirect costs, what are not your indirect costs. And from the NGO side, I think there lies a responsibility as well, is one, to know for themselves what is the real cost. Half the time, not half the time, majority of the time, they don't know what the real cost is. And I'm not saying fix an amount, but at least know for yourself what is the real cost, and therefore negotiate accordingly. Also transparency from the NGO side, as a collective, it needs to happen. So there is change that is required on both sides, right? So again, if you do not collaborate, if you don't work together, it's not going to change, right? So the responsibility lies with the funder, but the responsibility also lies with the NGOs working there. I think if the funders become more proactive, the insecurities that they face, I think that's the first thing we need to address, is provide security, provide stability, and collectively provide that as a funding community. I think that's the responsibility that lies with us, right? And I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Dhruvi. So many quotable quotes there, and such transparency in what you shared. I would really wish we could send a recording of just this snippet to all CSR organizations in India. So you're certainly going to hear more from us to be on the panels to influence more CSR funders. And my favorite was that CSR law does not restrict, and really CSR law does not provide any percentage for indirect costs. So I think that message is something that everybody says just the opposite end of when we speak to CSR organizations. So thank you for that input. I'll go on to Vimy, and like you said, Vimy, it's certainly a lot of pride that CIFF can talk to about saying that they do multiple years of funding, flexible funding, and of course a strong OD function that you've helped co-develop, co-design, and now implement. So certainly that helps not just foreign foundations that can look at your example, but also several domestic foundations. So we would love to hear of your journey there, and also if you could share how you convinced internal stakeholders to actually invest in OD when many might be focusing more on programmatic results, especially where an organization like CIFF has such a strong data evidence mindset about results. And we see in the chat that, what are the benefits of investing in OD, right? So how do you manage all those expectations and continue on your journey?
Yeah. I could probably start very briefly with the multi-year funding and then move on to OD. So I think what we believe in CIFF is that, and we look for transformational change, and that takes time. So recognizing that CIFF does provide multi-year funding to its partners, and depending on the investment, this could be anywhere between 2 to 5 years. The average is about 4 years or so. And we think this has allowed CIFF to cultivate more strategic partnership with our grantee partners. It has increased predictability for the partners themselves, which is critical to be able to focus the energy and effort in implementing the program. And it also provides flexibility to respond to emerging needs or developments, on ground. And it also reduces the transactional or operational costs, both for CIFF and our partners. Moving on to OD, as I said, this is not an area that CIFF did not have an OD function too long back. We started it in 2019 actually. And so we basically look for ways to make systemic change along with our partners, whether it's through new policies, new large-scale programs, behavior change, and wherever required, we provide OD support. So it's not that we provide OD support to each and every grantee, but mostly to our strategic grantees, and also where the grantees feel that this will add value to them. We have a highly engaged board and a very structured and rigorous grant-making process. Sometimes, it's too rigorous, we feel, but we do have it, and that's an advantage, I feel. And putting forward a compelling investment proposal with a very clear theory of change to achieve the outcome and impact is very important at CIFF. And we are also a data-driven organization, so therefore the use of evidence and data, as you said, Preeta, to drive decision-making also means that there is always a robust monitoring and evaluation framework that is developed as part of any investment, whether it's program investment or OD investment. So, those are the sort of, I would say, ingredients of, trying to convince that internal influence that we do both with our board as well with our program investment committee whenever we take any proposal to them. The OD investments are made in line with our OD strategy, which was presented and approved by our board in early 2019. And we do have an overall mandate from the board to invest about 1% of multi-year funding towards OD. And to prioritize our effort, because it's not a very big amount, so we have to be quite prudent about where we spend it. So we do deploy most of our OD grants to an identified set of strategic partners who are aligned with us on approach, strategy, and also where it's very critical for our sector strategy as well. And where we feel the OD intervention is very important for the success of the program and also for building the resilience and sustainability of our partners. And mostly it's given to local partners in Asia and Africa and the global south. So the OD team basically works quite closely with our partners, program teams, finance team, EME teams. I mean, that's a key stakeholder, you can say, for the OD team to develop any proposals. So we identify and agree areas of OD support with these stakeholders. And the starting point usually is giving the ownership to the grant, to the partner, to the grantee partner, who undertakes an OCAT, which is a self-assessment to reflect, as a lot of people on this call would know, to reflect on the areas of organizational strength as well as the areas for improvement. And this is followed by a series of consultation with the partner to prioritize OD need. And every OD investment is developed in a consultative way and approved internally by our CEO via the grant management process. Also hearing back feedback from our grantees and program teams on the value that the OD program is adding, since it's not a very old function, is quite critical. So therefore, what we are doing this year is currently we are conducting an independent OD portfolio evaluation, and we're going to use the learning from that evaluation to help us define our work on OD better, but also use that to strengthen the value that the OD investments are making within CIFF and our board. And I'm hoping that we hear good things from partners. I think I'm going to stop at that and hand it back.
Thank you. Thank you, Vimi. Moving on to Sujata, I think a lot of NGOs clearly on this panel, listening to this panel, as we saw in the poll result. So if you could touch upon 2 or 3 things. One, what caused that change of flick, right? To move from many years of not even thinking about OD or asking about it to your funders to then getting that kind of, aha moment or Einstein moment to actually invest in it. Second, how did you fundraise then for it? Like, were funders receptive? And thirdly, the big question, elephant in the room that funders keep asking, right? Like, what benefits did you experience? What were the results? So if you could touch upon those 3 in your journey, that would be great in the next kind of 3-4 minutes.
Sure, absolutely. Till about this is up till 2019 is where we had reached a stage in which we really didn't know whether we were going to survive. This is pre-pandemic. I won't say not survive, but we were honestly tired of being so hand to mouth at that point. I don't believe I went in asking for OD. I just went into some funders just saying, look, we're struggling, help us. So we went from this whole help us while not really clearly articulating what it is that we want. And that I think is one of the classic problems that a lot of NGOs face, just to say that we're very starved for funds. And at that point, the foundation that we went to just said, consider some OD support in this. At that point, honestly, I didn't know what that meant. And if you look at I think when we started with this whole OD journey that we worked with another organization on, we just went with a little bit of trust, saying, okay, it can't hurt. Let us see where this is going to go. When we started with this whole OD journey, we had Atma Foundation work with us. And when we spoke to them, it started off with, we thought it would be a magic wand and things would just get better and suddenly you'll do this. So it was an interesting journey for an entire year where we opened up everything, our processes, our systems, and we focused a lot on just our fundraising and M&E capability. And we identified that, or rather it was identified for us to be that these are your challenge areas in terms of resources available, as well as the knowledge of our systems and processes. And while we worked on it, while we didn't see the benefits immediately, over time, what happened was there was a systemic, almost a seismic shift in our mindset, in the top leadership itself of 17,000 feet to say, yes, there is a lot more to this than what meets the eye. And it was a journey that actually from then on, the first year when we were actually funded for this OD development to in the next couple of years, the shift moved on from actually me being able to have the confidence to go and tell funders, I need money for people, we need money for training for our internal staff and things like that. I mean, there is also an inherent, I think, we're inherently challenged when we want to go and tell funders these are our true costs. So I think that there was I think a lot of what has how we've managed. I mean, there's been a big shift and also the impact that we've been able to achieve in just the last year and a half. We've moved almost 6x in our funding in the last just a year and a half alone. And over then we've managed to fundraise for OD from multiple funders, simply because I think we're just far more transparent now, we're far more open about exactly what it is that we need. Somehow I believe at least in the past, I can speak for myself when we say as an NGO, I don't believe I've been that open to say I need this much or a person costs this much and this person is responsible for achieving this impact, right? So we went from this whole development. I think it is just changing the whole dialogue around this as to how we ourselves approached it. And the other thing, the benefits that I've seen, it's freed up. There's an inhibition that's been lifted off from our heads largely, and it has streamlined our processes so much more in terms of freed up my time for fundraising, my time for strategic thinking, which is largely as a leader is what I need. It has given the team so much more of a direction. The increased resources that we've been able to put it, we've been able to improve impact. We've geographically moved one state, which we've been struggling to do for the past 5 years. So from Ladakh now, we're also present in Sikkim. And yeah, I mean, it's been just a 2-year journey, but I think fundamentally as an NGO, I'm far more confident today of saying I can achieve this. I'm far more, by the way, we're also far more confident of being even accountable of the goals that we set for ourselves, right? We set a goal and half the goal is always stemmed with, can we really achieve this? Who's going to give us the money? Today, we're going to say we can do this. To be able to even set an audacious goal for ourselves for the next 5 years or 10 years. So yeah, so those have been the benefits, I think. And the other thing is our partnerships with our funders has grown, strengthened quite a lot. So this gone from we are the doers, you are the funders, to true partnerships where we're able to tell funders that, look, this program's not working as we think. I think we need a little bit more intervention, or can we course correct? We're not shy of saying that anymore. And we're finding that funders are actually super open to, talking about this. And yeah, I think it's a mindset change, and it is bringing about relevant or corresponding changes in our funders as well. So end of the day, I just want to, stop by saying that I think this is always the case. We were just very afraid to articulate it. This whole hand to mouth starvation cycle that we're currently in, or we just don't see beyond it. So I think I'll say this, just go out there and say what you need, ask and you just might receive.
Thank you, Sujata. I think you really brought the words trusted and partnership to life, and in a very concrete way that hopefully many NGOs that are listening in can implement. And Bimi, just before you had talked about how to make a case for that even within the funder organization. So I think those were both very practical steps, like end to end, what an NGO needs to do, and then how does a funder see it through to execution in terms of funding and other supports. On that note, I'll go to Nagma. I know she and her team have probably been barely getting any sleep over the last several months. I don't know what adrenaline special dose they're all running on as Grow Fund was launched and is now looking to disburse. But Nagma, talk us through that journey a little bit. You alluded to Grow Fund. So over the next 3-4 minutes, it'll be great to hear from you, how you selected the NGOs, ensuring this whole equity lens, ensuring people understood OD amongst those that applied to you, and how you selected the NGOs for support. And how are you going to go about it? So it'll be great to hear a summary snapshot of Grow's dream.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. We're all very excited. We are, yes, we are running on a high, and I hope it stays through the next 2 to 3 years where we see this culminate. But yes, if I have to summarize, but also give due weight to what we were really out to accomplish, what we see as funders is, and actually Dhruvi's covered almost every good point. And Vimi has already, reasserted it. So I don't know what I'm going to add to that. So I'll just speak about what else can be done when we see, unfortunately, that the development sector does have a bit of a power dynamics because of the resource concentration with funders. And so when we want a systemic shift or we want a mindset shift, what Sujata has done is stuck through, shown up, gone through the process, incredible pain, and still stuck around, and so is reaping the benefits of it. While that has to be celebrated, we also must be very cognizant that that cannot be everybody's story. That should not be everybody's story, because simply asking for what you want cannot be so difficult. And when we talk about a solution to a possible solution, we have to place the onus on those who hold the resources, because there is where that is when the system actually opens up to allow for those conversations. So even without a GROW, there used to be roundtables we would host with our co-funders of a project to really speak about the broader mission of why we are funding an organization. And these would be smaller conversations, which informed us a lot about what real good comes when funders come together and say, we will fund a purpose, instead of, like Dhwani correctly said, we will fund this project. So instead of saying my school having 500 children and how many marks in maths they get, it becomes okay, this area and how children in this geography get a better life through education. That's the when you bring more people together, the discourse changes, because the sum of the sum of all parts is much bigger than the whole. GROW was our attempt to say, if you are interested in funding organizational capacity, we will, as EdelGive, as a co-funder, not as an intermediary, not as a facilitator or a routing agent, as a co-funder, we will create systems that allow for all of us to come together and support this together. So we de-risk what we think we don't know, but we also make this a much, much bigger initiative than you and me. That was really the purpose. Also being able to ensure that funds reach the grassroots where the need is maximum. So the target group is not the group that is the large who can raise money for themselves, but the mid-sized organizations in India that are spread across all geographies. So the first agenda was organization building. The second was the mid-sized organizations. We've been asked again and again, why not small? And we say there's some place we had to start. So we started with mid. Because we are managing many kinds of risk. The third thing that we factored in then is that if we are really going out this big, making an effort of this kind, then we have to do justice to the inequities that creep in simply because we are so focused. If we are saying pan-India, if we are saying development sector, if we are saying ecosystem, then you have to design for the ecosystem. So before we even talked about funding and GROW as a project, it was about a pan-India fund where 100 NGOs will come from all the 4 zones in this country. And we signed up to say 25% from every zone is our commitment. So the hunt was on us. We will create processes that allow for inclusion. Here again, I would like to say, while we think that we are inclusive, simply by not designing for inclusion, we end up becoming, exclusive in our approach, because that's the flip side of being very focused, right? We know exactly what we want. We know exactly what kind of a organization we want. So that in itself leads to exclusion. So GROW was designed to include, and therefore geographical inclusion, sector inclusion was something that was designed at the very core of all of this. Every system of outreach has been designed for replication. It has been designed so that we hear the voices from the organizations. We received 2,300 registrations from this country, which is so grateful. The first call that came when the lines opened up was from the Andamans. And I cannot tell you what happened to our team when we realized the first call is actually coming from the Andamans, because there was a small group that was focusing on outreach to coastal areas. And many times we've been asked again, why did you take so much effort for the coastal areas? Again, because somewhere one has to begin the process of inclusion, not because it's a good to have, but because it's sensible. Because we cannot talk about a country like India and say pan-India and serve a focused, thriving ecosystem instead of looking for those who are left behind simply because they're difficult to reach. And I go through all this because whether we are creating a GROW, or whether we are funding organizations as independent philanthropists or CSRs, it becomes our, I think this part is our moral obligation, that we do a fair and decent job of really connecting with those who are doing the work that we say we are funding. And it cannot be a convenient way. It is usually inconvenient, but we have to fix that as part of the process. You were part of the shortlisting also. The entire way in which the application was created was not program centric. It asked basic questions about, teams. It asked questions about purpose. It asked a question about what is the worst that happened, and what would you do with this grant? So again, we tried to have more human-centric, approach to get organizations that are shortlisted in 100 that serve the entire mission of GROW, but also do justice to the promise of it all. Like I said, we've signed. So today, 53 MOUs have been signed. I think in another 4 days, 100 would have been signed. First tranches would have been given, and not one process has been designed for convenience. And I'm just very surprised that I have a team who actually shows up at work every morning after what they've gone through. But it's been the most incredible year of our life in EdelGive.
Well, thank you, Nagma. I think that, I'm sure a lot more one can share and discuss about this, but I know we just have about 10 minutes, but I think it's really important, some of the points you emphasized on the outreach that you all had to do to get the applications, and then the rigor and discipline with which you shortlisted and are now going through the process of helping the 100 NGOs that are selected. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump to some of the questions that are coming in the chat. I don't think we'll cover them all, so we will note those and reach out to you all individually, those participants who have asked us some thoughtful questions. But I'll come back to Dhruvi, and one of the questions, I'm sorry, Dhruvi, that you're going to have a lot of regulation-related questions, but there is a question from the audience about whether the new CSR amendments in any way affect giving for building strong organizations or OD. So any change to your way of thinking or any advice to CSR organizations as a result of the amendments?
There is restriction in what you could invest in corpus. So now there is you can't really give money as corpus, but that does not really stop you from investing in growing an organization. And here is an opportunity to differentiate the uses of the 2 or 3 kind of capital that gets invested in the sector. The philanthropy money, which is the non-CSR money, needs to now not replicate what CSR money can do, or take, the attributions now need to kind of change. The philanthropy money, which is non-CSR money, needs to be invested in exactly the things in which CSR cannot invest, and vice versa. There needs to be a conscious move. What I've been observing is the philanthropy money is following the CSR pattern. It needs to kind of start looking at it as a standalone fund. It's very similar to how you look at debt and equity. You need to start looking at philanthropic money, which means non-CSR money, and CSR money differently. I think this is the time to start doing that now. Yeah,
no, I think that's a great point about the complementarity of different sources of funding, because not everything needs to address the same need, and everybody needs to step in where somebody else can't do something.
Yeah.
The next question really goes to the nub of actually the Pay What It Takes initiative, which I know as anchor partners, Vimi and Nagma have been at the table to discuss this. But let's pick this up again, because one of the audience rightly asked, what do you really think is the root cause of this dissonance, right? The lack of trust, the lack of communication. Why do so many funders feel they're doing it all, but NGOs are clearly not experiencing it? So what is this trust deficit being caused by?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of several things, and the responsibility lies both sides. One, in not saying it, and the other not asking, right? And we all working on convenient assumptions. So like I said, the responsibility is on both sides. There is no fixed cost. Don't try and look for a cost to say set up a poultry unit. The cost will be different. You can't really replicate those costs. But it's very important to understand the context in which a particular intervention happens, right? And it's extremely important to listen to the person working with the community, right? You can only do so much sitting in an office looking at budgets. You have to understand and listen to those people. The other thing which I very strongly now believe, which the the NGO community needs to do is to also not recreate content which is already existing in the ecosystem. There needs to be data sharing, there needs to be information sharing between them. We keep creating training content. I mean, why? There is enough and more in the system. And look, the CSR money is limited. It's not enough to meet all the entire needs. So where do you bring in efficiencies, right? And again, that responsibility lies on both sides, but this responsibility lies more on the NGO side, wherein how do you collectively become more efficient as an ecosystem? And again, on the funder side as well, is to invest in things that are progressive, things that are contextual. We keep forgetting the context, right? Context changes every 6 months. It's extremely important to be aware of the ecosystem in which you are operating. It's a tiny fund, right? It operates in a system which is funded by many other, government being the largest funder, and somewhere the CSR fund needs to align to the changing environment of investments.
Yeah, no, very true. I mean, I would have loved to do a full round robin because this trust issue is such a deep and big one. But one other panelist, if you could go, I know we just have 4 to 5 minutes, but any one of you three who want to add to what Dhruvi said, like what's the root cause of this trust deficit and lack of transparent communication?
I think there's mixed signals also, mixed signals from both. Like for every organization, every funding organization that will say, show us your true costs, there will be 3 others will say that, you're too costly and there is no efficiency in the cost. Similarly, from the development sector, from the organizations that are operating on the ground, I've never heard a collective voice that came together and said, even 2 organizations together have never come to us and said, we really think we need to reevaluate the costs here. Yeah. I'm not even talking about OD costs. All right, let's just keep that aside. Corpus OD costs. We're talking about very evolved, terminologies. True cost, which is an accountant really going to come in a 3,000 per month salary? It's that simple. And if you're not going to get an accountant in 3 months, 3,000 salary, then at least 2 to 3 organizations have to come and say that an accountant costs so much. Never heard of it. 10 years and I've never heard anyone say that. And our team generally goes out and puts that back and says, are you really going to get this in this salary? Yeah. So what then happens is you hire a 10th pass where you need a graduate, you hire a graduate when you need a PhD, and then we all wonder why storytelling and reporting is so poor. So yeah, I just rested at that. But joint placement of any message is absent. And there's a lot of thinking that we have to do to say, forget the ecosystem. Can at least 3 of us go to our funder together?
Yeah. No, thanks, Nagma. So the remaining couple of minutes, maybe a minute each to Vimi and Sujata. Vimi, do you want to go first on any reactions to this big question or any other remarks?
Yeah, so I think on the NGO part, as Dhruvi said, it's on both sides. On NGO part, I think it's about, and I've seen that as well, lack of understanding of what my true costs are, which Nagma was also saying, and unable to articulate that or show the impact when given funding. And on the funder side, I think looking at it not in terms of partnership, when you will not look at your relationship in terms of partnership, but investment in program, you will invest only in program. You will not invest in that partnership. And also, what is it that we are trying to build? Are we trying to build great programs, or are we actually trying to build great sustainable organizations who can thrive even after we are not there? We're not supporting them as a funder. So I think it's a very ideological, as an ideology, the funders really need to reflect on that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think for us NGOs, there is also this perception of this power play. There's a power imbalance, so to speak, right? And I think a lot of nonprofits are kind of on the back, always feel that they're on the back foot, hence the lack of transparency in talking about true costs and what, getting what it takes, right? So that is something I think as an NGO, we need to work on ourselves and, empowering ourselves to be able to do that dialogue. And yes, also I think from the funder perspective, I think there's this whole thing about what Vimi also rightly said, right? If it is looked as an investment versus a partnership, this whole collaboration game that we're talking about, I agree with multiple. We have to talk about collaboration within NGOs. We'll talk about collaborations between NGOs and CSR. That doesn't exist for the most part. It's more transactional. We need to step away from the transactional. It is not transactional at all. And I think Prasad, you're the one who mentioned the whole transactional bit. I think we need to step away from there. So yeah, I just stop at that. And I think I've covered it in 1 minute.
Thank you. I think this has been a very, very insightful session. I'll just close this with 2 remarks. One, please, every one of you here, take this message far and wide. And please, every one of you here, please don't treat this as just a panel discussion, but actually some very actionable points that you can change in your day-to-day activities starting tomorrow, whether you're an NGO or a funder. I think Shashank shared the 3 R's for funders, reach out, reflect, start refining some of your policies, and NGOs also, like Sujata explained, or whatever position you're at, start having these conversations and looking at your organization in a different light. And finally, I would just like to end with one quote, which is actually not mine. It's stolen from one of the funders we interviewed. They actually told us this, NGOs are scared when they speak to us because they think that if they present anything very different, then they won't get funding. But what they should realize is that without the NGOs, we funders cannot live either, because we will not be able to disburse the money and we will not be able to actually have impact. So, that was such a powerful statement, because every funder needs NGOs to even realize their mission, while the power dynamic actually is sadly in the reverse because of just the monetary aspect. But really, the action does speak louder than words, or sometimes louder than money. So let's all go back with that message that, you need both parties to function in a very thriving way for the social sector to have greater impact. Thank you so much to the panelists. A bigger thank you to all of you who are listening, who are going to be our champions of change, we hope. And we'd be very happy to share offline any more information or answer queries. Apologies that this was a shorter session to not be able to pick every question. And a big thanks to Dasra, as always, for being a very strong partner, not just in DPW, but also in working with us on Pay What It Takes. So have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a final feedback poll before you all press the leave meeting button. We'd be grateful for all your responses.